First of all, it's now my great pleasure to introduce the Right Honourable Dr. Julian Lewis, the Member of Parliament for New Forest East. Julian has a formidable reputation in the field of defence and disarmament. He led the challenge to dangerous unilateralism in the 1980s, and in the 1990s he became the defence specialist in the Conservative Research Department. In 1996 he resigned from central office so that he could actively campaign against the United Kingdom joining the euro. Yeah, that's quite right. John Major wanted to keep open the option of joining the euro. I always knew it was a strange parliament I was in, but that's what the Prime Minister of the day wanted. In 1997, Julian was elected Member of Parliament for New Forest East with a majority of 5,215 votes, which has subsequently increased to 25,000. The people of New Forest East certainly know when they've got an outstanding MP. In Parliament, Julian has always been prepared to exercise his judgment in what he considers to be the best interests of the British people. In 2015, he voted against authorising UK military intervention in Syria. On the 27th of March 2019, he voted to leave the European Union on the 12th of April 2019 without a withdrawal agreement. There are a number of MPs that have a considerable grasp of defence issues, but none greater than that of Julian. In opposition, he was a defence spokesman, but when David Cameron became Prime Minister, he foolishly allocated Julian's defence brief to the Lib Dems as part of his coalition agreement. Subsequently, the House of Commons recognised Julian's defence expertise and elected him chairman of the Defence Select Committee. Defence and security issues are now at a critical juncture. Following the UK government's decision regarding 5G, which we've already debated to some extent in the previous session, and our future defence relationships with the United States, our allies across the world, and our European partners are now very much at the crossroads. Today, there is no better speaker than Julian Lewis to address these issues and open our debate. Ladies and gentlemen, could you please welcome the Member of Parliament for New Forest East.
Well, ladies and gentlemen, after that introduction, I feel somewhat unequal to the task, but I shall do my best. On the 8th of May coming, we will be marking the 75th anniversary of VE Day. On VE Day itself, a famous cartoon was published in the Daily Mirror. It was by Philip Zeck, and it showed a bloodied and bandaged soldier astriding the ruins of Europe, handing over a piece of paper on which were written the words "Victory and Peace in Europe." And his saying in the caption to this haunting image, his saying, "Here you are, don't lose it again." And it's often misunderstood that the people who have been amongst the most ardent opponents of the Euro-federalist movement are those who understand that message better than most others in this country. For example, although he rarely refers to it, Bill Cash has a special connection with Normandy. Does anybody know that? Yes. Yeah, a few of you do. His father is buried there. His father, Captain Paul Cash, was fighting in the Normandy campaign so courageously that he was recommended for and awarded the Military Cross. But in the end, it was his family who had to receive it because he had been killed in action, freeing part of Europe from Nazi tyranny. Marc Francois, who spoke so eloquently earlier, made that passing reference to his father's role in the liberation of Europe. He's proud of that, and he is right to be. I have to confess that I was very much a slow learner about Europe because I am not an economist and I am not really a constitutionalist and I'm not even a lawyer. What I am is somebody who understands power relations. And I'd like to refer to this little device here because I'm reminded of the fourth time I ever made a speech in Parliament, and it was in early December 1997. And I was about to explain the same thing to the House of Commons as I'm explaining to you, which is, I said, it may come as a bit of a shock to honourable members to know that I'm something of a Johnny-come-lately Eurosceptic. And at that, one of my friends on the Conservative benches shouted out, "You took far too long!" And it will amuse you to know that that was the Honourable Member for Buckingham, one John Bercow. But after I had recovered from his sedentary intervention, I said he was absolutely right, and I said I could even name the day on which I became a Eurosceptic. It was the 22nd of March, 1995, when I read an article in the Times which was headed, "Santa seeks a right to shape foreign policy for Europe." Now, that was not a reference to Father Christmas. It was to the then head of the European Commission, Jacques Santer. And the article explained that he believed Brussels should have the right to shape Europe's foreign and security policy, a power currently jealously guarded by the governments of the European Union's 15 member states. And he called for a strengthening of the European Commission as the guardian of the European treaties. He said that the Commission should be given the right of initiative in foreign and security policy. Now, ladies and gentlemen, I like to think the best of people, even when I disagree with them. And I do believe that many of the founders of what later morphed into the European Union are sincere when they say, as they often do say, and they say it much more on the continent than they say it here, where here the European project has always been sold to us in primarily economic terms, but on the continent, when they're selling it to their people there, they always say that the European Union is not primarily about economics, it's primarily about peace. And of course, there is a long and one could even say honourable history of people trying to believe that if somehow the countries, or at least some of the countries of Europe, could be bound together by common ties, it would make it harder for them to go to war with one another. Whether Britain was ever intended to be part of that particular project is, however, very much open to doubt. And in fact, the speech of Winston Churchill at Zurich, which is so often quoted, or I should say misquoted, in support of the European Federalist project, actually read, and I remember quoting it to the House of Commons back then in December 1997, Churchill made this speech on the 19th of September 1946, and he said, "I'm now going to say something that will astonish you. The first step in the recreation of the European family must be a partnership between France and Germany. In this way only can France recover the moral leadership of Europe." And he went on to say, "Under and within that world concept, we must recreate the European family in a regional structure called, it may be, the United States of Europe. In all this urgent work, France and Germany must take the lead together. Great Britain, the British Commonwealth of Nations, mighty America, and I trust Soviet Russia, for then indeed all would be well, must be the friends and sponsors of the new Europe and must champion its right to live and shine." Now, nobody who understands the English language can interpret that as anything other than a plea for France and Germany to bury their ancient differences and mutual distrust, even hatred, and for an independent Britain to support them in that worthy into that. And when one ever explored this question about how this was going to keep the peace of Europe, one quickly realized that the whole idea was bound to be counterproductive. Because if you think about history, if you think about the circumstances where countries go to war with one another, I can ask you to name me examples where dictatorships go to war with other dictatorships, and you wouldn't have any difficulty. And I can ask you to name me examples where dictatorships go to war against democracies. And democracies, even, like we did in 1939, go to war against dictatorships, and you wouldn't have any difficulty. But you know what I'm going to say next. If I ask you to give me examples where democracies go to war with other democracies, you would find it very difficult to come up with any realistic examples, and the few that you would come up with would usually be straining the concept of what constitutes a pluralistic constitutional democracy to its very limits. So if you want to keep the peace within Europe, the answer surely must not be to dismantle the democratic structures which are the best guarantee that the countries of Europe will not fight each other. But not only did the progression from the European Economic Community to the European Community and then to the European Union, not only did that progression undermine the very system of separate, independent, pluralistic constitutional democracies that were the best guarantee of peace, and ask yourself this: was there ever any danger of war between the component countries of Europe, between that VE Day cartoon being published in May 1945 and the formation of the European Union? No, there wasn't. The only danger to peace in Europe there came from an external source, as Winston Churchill noted in a passing reference in that quotation that I've just given you. which was there was a danger that the Soviet Union, now being in occupation of half the continent, could try to go further. And what was the best way to deal with that? Well, the best way to deal with that was to tie the defense of Europe as closely as possible with the largest democratic power on earth, the United States of America. And guess what? The Labour government of 1945 to 1950 did a brilliant job in doing just that. And so the NATO treaty was signed in 1949. Now I ask you to do something which is always a little bit dangerous, which is to engage in a degree of counterfactual history. And what I put to you is this. Imagine that you could go back to 1914 when we went to war to defend the neutrality of Belgium, or 1939 when we went to war to defend the neutrality, or indeed to honor the alliance that we had with Poland. Now, in each of those cases, supposing the United States, instead of coming into each of those wars much later, as they did, supposing the United States had been bound by treaty to defend Belgium in 1914 and Poland in 1939, do you think that Germany in either of those cases would have been as likely, more likely, or hardly likely at all to have risked provoking those wars by invading those countries? I think the answer to that is obvious. So as the European Union gradually developed, and as it metamorphosed from something that we were primarily being asked to look at in economic terms into something that was clearly designed to create a political entity called Europe with a single foreign and defense policy, it became obvious to me that it was endangering peace in Europe, both internally and externally. Internally, because it was undermining the system of free, independent, democratic states that the best guarantee that countries don't go to war with one another, and externally, because it was in danger of duplicating the NATO alliance without the single biggest component that makes it effective, the participation of the United States of America. So far from being a force for peace in the world, the European Union was actually putting peace at risk. Now, I just want to move a little wider than the European Union itself to talk about where we are with defense as a factor in our calculus of national priorities. And I've got a little illustration here which you won't be able to see, but you might take on board the lower graph. This is what has been happening to defense expenditure over the period from the mid-1950s to the present day, when defense expenditure is measured as a proportion of GDP. And just to give you an idea, let me explain that the reverse has been happening with certain other high-spending departments. So if we go all the way back to 1963, you see that the rising graph of expenditure on benefits and welfare crossed over with the falling graph of expenditure on defense in 1963, when they were both getting 6% of GDP. 6%. Not 2%, which you hear so much about for defense, 6%. Well, that was a long time ago. You come forward to the mid-1980s, and in the mid-1980s, defence, education and health were all getting about 4.5% to 5% of GDP. Now, education is still getting that sort of figure, which is 2.5 times what we spend on defence. Health is getting between 7 and 8% of GDP, which is nearly 4 times what we spend on defence. And of course, benefits and welfare, having been up as high as 12% of GDP, which was 6 times what we spend on defence, has dipped to about 11%. And so when we hear this great shopping list of all the unleashed billions that the government is going to spend, my appeal to you is to put in a good word for defence, and just remember that until the Cameron Lib Dem coalition came along, no one ever thought about the idea that we would dip as low as the NATO minimum, and that's what it is. It's a minimum, not a target, of 2% of GDP. Indeed, when I was a shadow defence minister for slightly longer than the Second World War, I used to criticise the Blair and Brown governments for spending only 2.5% of GDP on defence. And so the figure that I believe is both necessary and realistic is to have an aim to get back to 3% of GDP on defence, which would be not the levels that we spent as recently as the mid-1980s in the closing phases of the Cold War, but as recently as 1994 to 1995, when we had already been 6 years from the fall of the Berlin Wall, and when we had already taken the peace dividend. Now, it seems to me that there are a few little points I should finish off with in relation to where we've been with the Brexit battle. It's common to give credit to the 28 Spartans, of whom I'm proud to include myself, who voted against the Brexit in name-only departure deal. But when Mark Francois earlier referred to some of the parties he went to on the night of our departure from the European Union, one of them was the one I was at. It was the one by John Moynihan, who has done a great deal to support pro-Brexit groups and organisations. And he gave a speech in which he made some unlikely awards to people without whom Brexit could probably never have been saved. Amongst these people are 6 Conservative MPs who, like the 28 Spartans, voted no 3 times. Dominic Grieve, Justine Greening, Sam Gyimah, Joe Johnson, Guito Bebb, and Philip Lee. Because if you remember, that third vote was defeated by a majority of 58. And if my mathematics are correct, if the 28 Spartans had voted the other way, we'd have still been 2 short of the total that we needed. Now to Gina Miller, because if Gina Miller had not got her court victory, then Theresa May, once she had finally decided on Brexit in name only, would not have needed to get it through Parliament, and we would have exited, but we would have exited in terms of the Chequers deal. In other words, we would have been in a situation where, after some years had gone by, we would have realized that we were probably worse off even than when we had been members. And so to award the palm to some of the people like that and to bring the topic back to defence is a little difficult, but I'll do it in this way. And the way I'll do it is to say it only goes to show you what happens in complex situations is you cannot predict the consequences of what you do. And that was why when one of my honourable fellow MPs accosted me in the men's loo off the division lobby and said, "Are you going to vote for the deal then, Julian?" And I said, "No." And he said, "Well, you'll lose. You can say goodbye to Brexit." That's what he said to me. And I said, "Well, I don't think so." Because it was easy enough for people like me who've been around for a long time to decide what to do, because I'd made up my mind that one of the reasons why this terrible project of EU integration had got as far as it did was that good people, and I mean genuinely good people, repeatedly gave in to the idea that they've got to hold their nose and vote for something that they know is wrong in order to avoid something worse. And I simply decided, and so did our 27 other colleagues, simply decided that we were not going to play that game. But amongst the 28, look particularly at the newer ones, the younger ones, people like Julia Lopez, for example, a brand new MP who had their whole political career stretching into the future, probably at risk of coming to a devastating halt. And those are the people who, in my opinion, deserve the medal for heroism. They resisted huge pressure. I've even seen some MPs in tears at some of these meetings at the thought of what they were going to have to do, but they did it just the same. Now, to finish on a lighter note, I always like to conclude with a piece of research-based news. And it's recently come to my attention that some research has shown that 2.5 minutes into any given speech on any given topic by any given orator, 93% of any given audience stop concentrating on what he or she is saying and instead start daydreaming of their favorite sexual fantasies. I have now been speaking for at least 21 minutes, so I'm delighted to have given so much pleasure to so many people.